Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for this kind invitation to share with you today something of my experience in helping to manage the services via the presentation, the use of the KanBan method. So I'm going to talk about the meeting between service management and the KanBan method. Yes, you KanBan. My name is Robert Falkowitz, and I'm a lean and KanBan coach and trainer, but I have a long background in IT and in service management. You can use these addresses to get in touch with me if you would like to do so. So let me just tell you a little bit about why I'm talking about this topic and how I've gotten to the point of being interested in the use of KanBan to help manage services. When my career in Switzerland, I involved in the development of software. And after that, I did a lot of project management, integrations, and so on and so forth. And at one point, I came to a crossroads in my development. I was working with an organization where I became aware of the first version of ITIL. I read a number of the fascicles of ITIL version 1, and I said, this is great stuff. This is really going to help our organization. And I became heavily involved in using the principles of service management and the practices of service management to help organizations. And at that time, I left the area of software development and really focused exclusively on service management. I helped to relaunch, and this is back about 20 years ago, itSMF in Switzerland, which was focused mostly in the Suisse romande. I also got involved in activities at itSMF International in various committees that they were working on. And I also participated, not as an author, but especially in the area of translations of ITIL publications and also the translations of the ITIL examinations into the French language. But especially, I got involved in working with organizations and helping them to do a better job of managing their services using various practices like ITIL and other practices. And this went on for about 10, 15 years. And I became aware at a certain point that the huge effort that we were putting into helping organizations in terms of the large number of people, the investments in software, and so on and so forth, was helpful, but the benefits didn't ever really seem to be aligned with the effort that was involved. And especially when you looked at the benefits of doing better service management from the perspective of the customers of the service, they didn't always see all that much difference. And it was about 12 years ago that I came to another crossroads. I became aware that there were ways that we could make radical improvements in how well we're doing in managing services. And at that crossroads, I kind of largely left behind service management as a discipline, and I became much more heavily involved in flow management. And flow management, and in particular, using the KanBan method for managing the flow of work. And I found that once again, this was a way, there was a dictate in my mind, and I said, this is going to be a great way of helping organizations to move forward. So let me explain the contrast between what service management had been at the time and how KanBan and flow management was different. So typically, when we were working, let's say in the early 2000s, in helping organizations to improve how they manage services, one of the typical things we would create would be something like this process diagram. In this case, looking at change management. I'm not saying this is but just as a typical kind of output that we created. And it was very useful because it helped to clarify what needed to be done, What were the various roles and responsibilities? So there definitely were benefits. But in fact, this is only a very, very partial view of the reality of what's happening when a team wants to manage changes and then more generally manage any part of service. If we look at the perspective of flow management at exactly the same kind of activity, we can make a very different sort of diagram. And here we see what is essentially a timeline starting from the beginning when you first start to manage a change, going all the way through to the end when you deliver value. And you see that the timeline is divided into two types of areas, the yellow areas and the red areas. The yellow areas correspond precisely to the various phases of the process that we saw in the previous diagram. But the red areas cover all the area that was actually not described in the process flow diagrams before. And from a lean perspective, these red areas represent the waste that is inherent in the work that you are doing. In this particular case, I show in particular the waiting that occurs, but there are many other types of waste that do occur in the context of doing any kind of work. So we give visibility to the contrast between the value-added activities we're performing and the non-value-added things that we're doing in the course of doing our work. Now, we have a metric that allows us to measure this relationship. It's called flow efficiency, and flow efficiency is simply the value-added time divided by the cycle time. So let me give you an example of that. Let's suppose we're doing a certain type of work. From the start of the work until we deliver value, it's 100 hours. And during those 100 hours, we actually only do 50 hours of value-added work. Therefore, the flow efficiency is 50 divided by 100. We typically express it as a percentage. So flow efficiency in this example of 50%. Now, I'd like to ask you, those who are listening today, what, in your opinion, is the typical flow efficiency for knowledge workers? If you are present in the room, you can just say it out loud. If you are dialing in, connecting in, you might use the chat as a way of expressing your idea about what flow management might be. So, any ideas about that? We have the 30%. Any other suggestions? Well, think about that. And I will come back and share my screen again. It turns out that the typical flow efficiency for an organization that hasn't really done any specific work in trying to improve flow efficiency, improve the flow of their work using a method like KanBan, the typical flow efficiency is in the range of 5% to 15%. And that really doesn't sound very good. That sounds like there's an awful lot of waste occurring in the time you're spending and trying to do work. And you might say, well, yes, in fact, if you've ever been on a project and you say the project has taken a year, and at the end of the year, you say, you know, I don't understand. We could have done this very, very more efficiently and much, much more quickly. If you ever had a feeling like that, then you intuitively understand that flow efficiency generally is very poor. When organizations have adopted KanBan as a method and they've been invested in developing their KanBan capabilities, what we typically see is they can get up to a flow efficiency of around 40%. Could be more, it could be less. You have to work on it. It takes time to develop it. And I'd like to say, well, what is in fact the benefit that you get in your organization of going from a flow efficiency of 5 to 15% to a flow efficiency of 40%, a 3 to 8 times increase. What is the value of that? So I think one of the most important things is the reduction in the lead times. How long does it take you to deliver value? And organizations see often this is an order of magnitude improvement. What does that mean? It means instead of taking a year to finish a project and deliver some value, you might be able to do it in a month. Instead of taking 3 weeks to do something, it might take you 3 days to do something. So that's a huge reduction in lead time. And the inverse of that is a huge increase in the throughput of a team. How much work can a team deliver in a certain amount of time? Now, traditionally, if you have a need to deliver something more quickly or urgently, the traditional way of approaching that is the team says, well, we can't do it. You have to hire more people, more resources. That's the solution. Or they say, well, no, we don't have any money for more resources. You just have to work harder. So people get put under huge amounts of pressure in order to deliver work more quickly. And the result is they're under a great deal of stress. In the KanBan method, there is a huge respect for people, for workers. And instead of saying, well, just work weekends, work nights, and just deliver because you have to do it, we try to respect them and reduce stress. The result of doing this is that they're able to increase greatly the predictability of when they can deliver work. So when a customer comes to you and says, we need a service by a certain date, or we need a change in place by a certain date, what's the second question they always ask? When will you be able to deliver? And KanBan gives you the method and the statistics that allow you to give increased predictability for when you can deliver the results of that work. And the whole can be done at very little cost. Instead of these multi-million franc or dollar projects where you invest huge amounts of time and resources, KanBan can be done with very, very little cost. So I would imagine that anybody said, well, anybody hearing, well, look, here's a method. It doesn't cost very much. It doesn't require a huge amount of effort on your part. It increases your throughput tremendously. It reduces your lead times tremendously. It makes your work much more predictable. Are you interested in that? Would you like to find out more about that? And I would hope your answer would be, well, yes, that sounds great. Well, what's the reality behind it? So let's take a closer look at what KanBan is. KanBan was originally developed as a part of the Toyota production system. Taiichi Ono, who was one of the instrumental forces in developing that system, defined KanBan as the operating method of the Toyota production system. But of course, Toyota was manufacturing trucks and automobiles. They had assembly lines where they were transforming and putting together steel and rubber and plastic to make their cars. What has happened is that within the past 20 years or so, that method has been adapted for use in knowledge management systems. And of course, what we're doing in service management and virtually all of the service economy is knowledge management. In other words, instead of taking raw materials and transforming them and making goods, physical goods, we take data and information and ideas, and we transform them and create information and knowledge as a way of supporting the decisions that we make. So what is this KanBan that has been adapted for knowledge management? Well, what you will often see is people today will say something like, KanBan is a visual management method, a visual project management method. Well, that's not false, but it's rather like saying that, let's say, Leonardo da Vinci, who was he? Oh, he made sketches, didn't he? He was an Italian who made sketches. Well, that's true. He was Italian. and he did make sketches, but you would have completely missed the point of what it's all about and what his impact on culture of the Renaissance was. And it's the same thing with Kanban. Is it a visual project management method? Well, there is a visual aspect, and you can use it for managing projects, but Kanban is so much more than that. It's so much more important than that. So I hate this definition of Kanban. It's completely misleading. Instead, what we can think about when we talk about Kanban is first a set of principles for managing the flow of work. 3 principles. Start with what you're doing now, agree to pursue evolutionary incremental change, and encourage acts of leadership at all levels. Anybody who has studied ITIL version 4 probably have heard of these principles before, but what you need to know is that these principles were articulated even before ITIL version 3 was published. So now you know where they come from. In addition, Kanban is a set of practices for managing the flow of work. So let's take a closer look at what those practices are. First of all, manage the flow. Proactively manage the flow. Look at the bottlenecks that exist in the flow of your work. Look at the things that are impeding the flow of your work. Look at how you're wasting time and seeing what you can do to eliminate waste as part of your process. So this is managing the flow of work. Secondly, limit work in progress. So get away from the traditional idea that if I want to finish something earlier, I need to do that by starting it earlier. And this leads to the process of starting a lot of different things in the hope that you're going to finish them all earlier. And the reality is it's just the opposite. The more things you try to do simultaneously, the slower everything becomes. What Kanban says is limit the work in progress. And in this way, you will actually deliver everything more quickly. And at the same time, you will be able to focus more on finishing work rather than starting work, on delivering value rather than keeping busy. The third practice is make policies visible. Complete transparency in terms of how you make decisions in managing the flow of work. So, for example, if you decide to work on one item, one type of task rather than another type of task, you do it according to policies that any of your stakeholders are aware of and will be able to understand in a transparent way why you've made the decisions you've made. Improve collaboratively. So we saw before as a principle the idea of evolutionary change and incremental change. Those improvements need to be done in a collaborative way amongst the various participants in the system that is your organization that delivers and manages services. What we know, what we have to get away from is the idea that we simply make an improvement in one area and that automatically makes improvements in all areas. That simply isn't the case. It's a complex system, and making an improvement in one area can actually make things worse in another area. So improvement has to be done in a collaborative way and understanding what's important in the overall system. Use feedback loops. Of course, this is a very old idea, the PDCA loop, but of course, Kanban will be able to work with other types of feedback loops. Perhaps you use the DMAIC type loop from the lean perspective. Perhaps you're interested in using OODA loops, but they're very important in being able to measure the improvements that you make. But what's important is that Kanban gives you the framework with when you can make good measurements and objective measurements about the flow. And last but least, there is the practice of visualizing the work. So it is part of Kanban, But the reality is you can actually get all the benefits of Kanban without visualizing the work. The great thing about visualizing the work is that it helps people at the very beginning to gradually get into the practice of Kanban and seeing what is happening rather than trying to imagine it in their own minds. So it is part of the practices, but it is far from being the most important practice. It's useful at the beginning, but not in the long term. The real benefits come from the other practices. So this is Kanban. This is how you can use it for helping you to improve how you manage services in your organization. I think, in my experience, that it is the single most important thing you can do to make a very important and inexpensive improvements to the management of services. And for this reason, I say you can bank on Kanban, and yes, we Kanban. Thanks very much for listening to me. And we have a couple of minutes. I'd be happy to hear your questions and address any questions that you might have. You can either put them in the chat, or if you're in the room, you can ask out loud.
Thanks, Robert. I have a question for you. So what do you think about, because now we speak that we know that in this area, the Scrum is the standard de facto approach to work. What do you think about, so what is Kanban, is in which companies, in which environments Kanban is more efficient than Scrum?
So Kanban is by its nature much more agile than Scrum because it doesn't create fixed time boxing for when you need to accomplish work. The reality is, in our VUCA world, where things are unpredictable and highly variable and very uncertain, things happen that prevent you from following strictly an exact plan. Kanban helps you to avoid wasting time on plans that you can almost never fully complete. So it's inherently more efficient. But in the transition from a situation where people only do what the plan says they should do to a situation where they become responsible for organizing their own work in a team, sometimes teams will find it useful to go via a transition first to Scrum and then later a transition to Kanban, because Scrum includes this planning aspect for each sprint, which some people might find helpful. I should also add to that Scrum has been subject to various frameworks with the intention of trying to make it scalable up to large organizations. And honestly, these are very heavyweight and complex frameworks. Kanban is by its nature scalable and is very easy to extend to large and complex organizations just by doing the same thing at different levels without having to add layers of controls, new roles, and so on and so forth. So I personally think that Kanban is potentially the much more effective and efficient approach.